Hello everyone and welcome back. If you are new to our community, please consider hitting that subscribe button to join us as we dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories the world has to offer. And if you are a returning viewer, I am genuinely so glad to have you back, friend. In this special feature, we are exploring 12 stories that have already been featured on the channel, but these are a curated collection of both my personal favorites and yours, all centered around the bone-chilling isolation of winter in the Appalachian Mountains, a region where beauty and terror often walk hand in hand. I really hope you enjoy revisiting these harrowing tales as much as I do. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the frozen silence of the mountains. But remember, viewer discretion is highly advised. I still think about that trip more often than I wish I did, even though it has been years, and even though I have done everything I can to push the memory down into the part of my mind where I keep things that feel too massive and terrifying to deal with. It was supposed to be a harmless getaway, one of those early winter escapes where a group of friends rents a family cabin in the Appalachians before the ski season fully kicks in, just to unwind, disconnect from the chaos of the world for a few days, and make dumb memories that only matter to us. Bruno's family had owned that place for generations, a small, rustic old cabin tucked deep in the woods above a tiny mountain town in West Virginia, surrounded by ridgelines that felt both peaceful and suffocating depending on how far you wandered into the tree line. They went there every year, sometimes multiple times, and he always spoke about it like it was this sacred space where nothing bad ever happened, a nostalgic place where he'd grown up skiing badly and drinking cheap beer with cousins who never cared if he fell on his face. We arrived at the cabin late on a Thursday evening, tired from the drive but buzzing with excitement, and the plan for the next day was simple: wake up early, have a quick breakfast, and spend the day skiing down the smaller slopes behind the ridge that overlooked the property. We were stupidly overconfident, too used to doing things without checking weather updates, too busy laughing and throwing our gear around to notice the urgent notifications our phones had been sending since the night before. Only later did I realize how irresponsible we had been, how none of us had bothered to look at the weather advisory, clearly stating that everyone in that region should stay home because of a heavy snowstorm expected to hit by late afternoon. We told ourselves that warnings were always exaggerated, that it wouldn't be that bad, and that at worst we would head back early if the wind got annoying. By the time we had our boots on and took our first clumsy runs down the slope, the morning felt harmless, the sky bright in that deceptive winter way where everything looked sharper and colder than it is, and I remember thinking how lucky we were that we had the whole day to act like idiots without anyone else around to witness it. Around noon, though, something shifted, and not just in the weather. I felt a sharp, sickening pain shoot through my ankle after a bad landing, and even though I tried to brush it off, I knew immediately that I had messed something up. Walking felt wrong. Like every step made my bones grind together just slightly out of place, sickeningly audible in my own head. I told the others I would head back to the cabin, and since we were still close enough to the ridge that I could see the cabin roof through patches of trees, it seemed like an easy, boring walk downhill that wouldn't take more than 40 minutes if I didn't push it. The plan was simple. I'd get back, rest my foot, warm up, maybe make tea, and wait for them to return within an hour or two at most. Nothing about that sounded threatening, and nothing about it felt like the beginning of something I would still be thinking about decades later. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me out of habit more than caution, and I remember how the silence inside felt heavier than usual, like the storm had already started pressing against the walls long before the first flurries appeared. I spent the next hour limping around the place, trying to familiarize myself with where everything was since I'd never stayed there before, opening drawers and cabinets and closets just to distract myself from how strangely uneasy I felt being up there alone. It wasn't a fear of the woods or the isolation, not exactly. It was more the awareness that I didn't have the experience the others did, that I wasn't used to being in places where the nearest help was miles away and the phone signal came and went like a breathing thing. Bruno had the satellite phone in his pack, so if something happened, I was stuck with the regular cell that only worked when it felt like being generous. Snow began falling harder outside, sticking to the window frames and piling against the porch railing in suffocating drifts, but I kept assuming they would be back soon. Then an hour passed, then another. I watched the light fade behind the ridge, watched the forest grow darker and heavier, and the more I stared out the window, the more I felt a cold I knew wasn't coming from the broken weather strip under the kitchen door. I tried calling them, texting, refreshing the signal, holding the phone in the corner of the cabin that Bruno had said sometimes caught a bar or two, but nothing went through. The wind was starting to howl, not violently yet, but enough that I kept glancing at the tree line and imagining shapes moving between the branches. By the time night hit for real, I was almost sick with worry. My thoughts kept cycling through the same scenarios, one of them slipping, another getting lost, all of them stuck in the storm with temperatures dropping fast. I tried reasoning with myself, telling the logical part of my brain that they were experienced enough to handle this. But the truth was that the storm was getting bad fast, much faster than we had expected, and the silence in that cabin felt like a weight pressing into my lungs. Around 8,000 p.m., when I'd already convinced myself something horrible had happened, my phone buzzed, startling me hard enough that I dropped it on the couch. It was a message written at the edge of whatever signal he must have caught. They had gotten caught in the storm. Visibility had disappeared in minutes, and they'd been forced to descend the mountain toward the town rather than try to make it back to the cabin. They were safe, but they would have to stay there overnight. He included a rushed explanation of the cabin basics, where the firewood was kept, which switch controlled the backup generator, where the emergency blankets were, though I had already found most of it while nervously pacing earlier. Knowing they were safe should have calmed me, but instead it made me realize that I truly was spending the night alone in that cabin, with no stable connection to the outside world and no real experience surviving in conditions like that. I kept telling myself it was fine, that it would be a story to laugh about someday, that nothing bad actually happens in places where families spend decades skiing and drinking hot chocolate on weekends. Still, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked, lowered the shutters, and double-checked every latch. Then I started a fire, sat close enough to feel the heat, and tried not to think about how big the shadows in the corners looked when the flames flickered. But I miscalculated the firewood. I told myself the pile of logs beside the hearth would last longer, that I'd grabbed enough earlier while inspecting the cabin, but less than an hour later the fire was shrinking, cracking softly as the last logs burned down. I knew how quickly the temperature could drop once the fire went out, and with the storm building into something loud and relentless, the idea of letting the cabin get cold felt like a mistake I couldn't afford. So, I convinced myself I had no real choice but to head out to the woodshed for more. The woodshed wasn't far, maybe 30 or 40 feet from the cabin, but still, the moment I opened the door, the wind felt like a shove to the chest, sharp and thick with snow. I held my flashlight low to avoid blinding myself with the reflection, kept my hood tight around my ears, and moved as fast as I could without slipping. The shed was barely more than a small, crooked outbuilding with wooden walls that looked patched and soft from decades of storms. I shoved the door open, stepped inside, and breathed out the first sigh of relief. I filled my backpack with as many logs as it could handle, counting the seconds in my head and telling myself I'd be inside by the time I reached 50. But when I swung the shed door open to go back to the cabin, my stomach dropped so fast it made me nauseous. The snow outside wasn't smooth anymore. There were footprints, deep, fresh ones, and I knew instantly they weren't mine. For a moment I stood frozen, my breath fogging so hard it felt like I was hyperventilating, and then my body moved on its own. I stepped back into the shed and shoved the door closed, locking it with a rusted latch that looked like an inconvenience more than actual protection. My heart was pounding so violently I could feel it in my fingertips. The footprints were too big, too heavy, spaced like someone walking slowly, deliberately, and there was no reason for anyone to be near that cabin. No neighbors, no hikers, no random passerby. If someone approached in a storm like that without calling out for help, they weren't there by accident. I lowered myself to the small, cracked window and peeked through the glass. At first, I didn't see anything through the white blur of the storm, but then a shape emerged near the back of the cabin. A man dressed head to toe in black winter gear with some kind of headlamp creating a pale circle of light around his face. He was testing the rear window frame as if checking for weaknesses, moving slowly and methodically, never once looking up. I had no idea whether he knew I was in the shed, but the thought that he might have seen me walk out earlier made my skin crawl. I tried to breathe as quietly as I could, holding the frozen air in my lungs until it hurt. I knew those shed walls wouldn't protect me if he decided to come in. Anyone determined could push through rotten wood with a few good hits. I kept thinking about what he was doing, why he was testing the windows instead of knocking, why he didn't call out or shout or try to speak. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that whoever he was, he didn't want help and he didn't want shelter. He wanted inside. I waited until he disappeared from my line of sight before trying to think logically, which was almost impossible with how hard my hands were shaking. If I was going to make it back inside the cabin, I needed to leave the shed without him seeing me. But when I looked again, hoping he had moved deeper into the storm, I saw him appear suddenly near the front of the cabin instead. Either he was impossibly fast or there were two of them. I couldn't tell through the darkness and the wind, and the uncertainty was worse than the danger itself. My mind kept replaying every horror scenario I had ever heard about remote cabins, strangers, and storms that erased all sound. He was testing the front door now, pulling at the handle, pushing his shoulder against the frame. Even through the wind, I could hear the faint thud of his weight hitting the wood, and I felt my pulse spike so high I thought I might pass out. I ducked fast to avoid being seen through the window, crouching low enough that the cold from the shed floor seeped straight into my bones. I had no plan, nothing besides the desperate desire to stay alive, and the fear that every second I stayed there made it more likely he'd check the shed next. When I finally dared to look again, I didn't see him, but his headlamp glow appeared near the shed door a few seconds later. I watched the thin crack between the boards brighten as he came close, and then I saw his shadow crossing back and forth like he was listening or deciding whether to try the door. He touched the handle and pushed, and the old wood creaked under the pressure. It wouldn't take him long, maybe seconds. I searched the shed frantically for anything resembling a hiding place, but there was nothing besides stacks of wood, tools on walls, and an old tarp that wouldn't hide a person. I kept imagining what he'd do if he opened the door and saw me standing there, and that was when I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier, a second door half covered by a loose plank of wood leaning against it, a back exit I hadn't known existed. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the first key I tried, then the second, and I could feel tears of frustration and fear burning behind my eyes. The third key turned. The relief hit me so hard my knees buckled. I opened the door as quietly as possible, stepped out into the storm, and forced myself not to look back. I heard the shed door crack as he finally forced it open just as I started running. The snow swallowed every sound I made, which was the only reason he didn't catch me in the first 10 seconds. I sprinted through the darkness, the key to the cabin clenched so hard in my fist that it cut into my palm, and when I reached the porch, I risked a look back. He saw me. I watched him turn, hesitate for half a second, then break into a run straight toward me, the headlamp jerking violently with each step. I didn't think. I opened the cabin door, threw myself inside, locked it, and dragged anything heavy I could grab in front of it, a dresser, a bench, part of the coat rack pushing furniture with the kind of strength that only panic creates. I could hear him hitting the door, each impact rattling the frame. I knew none of it would hold forever. My hands found the handgun Bruno kept hidden above the fireplace, and without allowing myself to hesitate, I fired a single round into the cabin ceiling. The sound exploded through the room, sharp enough to make my ears ring and my skin vibrate. Silence followed. His hit stopped immediately. I didn't dare open the windows or move the barricade. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, feeding the fire whenever the flames dipped, keeping the gun across my lap, trying to control my breathing and listening for anything that wasn't the storm. But the wind swallowed everything and made the world outside feel impossibly far, like I was staring into a void with no way to know if something was staring back. I only let myself breathe again when hours later, sometime around 2000 the afternoon the next day, I heard familiar voices calling from outside, my friends. I practically collapsed when I heard them. The police came soon after, hiking their way up with equipment and disbelief written across their faces. They investigated everything, the footprints, the broken shed door, the marks on the cabin entry, but the storm had covered whatever tracks might have told the full story. Bruno kept repeating that nothing like this had ever happened in all the years his family had owned the place, that they'd never even seen strangers near the property. We left that same day without looking back. I don't know if the man was alone, or why he was there, or how long he'd been watching the cabin before I noticed the footprints. I don't know what would have happened if I'd been slower, if the back door hadn't existed, or if the gunshot hadn't scared him off. All I know is that the memory still sits in my chest like a cold stone, and I haven't gone back to the Appalachians since. What happened to me and my girlfriend in the hills of West Virginia all those years ago is something I still struggle to wrap my head around. Not because it felt supernatural or dramatic in the Hollywood sense, but because of how disturbingly human it all was, how deliberate every moment seemed once we pieced it together afterwards, and how easily everything could have ended badly if even one small thing had gone differently. It was early November, and we had both taken a few days off to get away from work and from the noise of town, thinking it would be good to reset by hiking and camping along one of the less traveled ridges near the Monongahela Forest. My girlfriend had grown up around cities, never really spent time deep in the woods, and she'd been saying for months that she wanted to see what it felt like to fall asleep under a sky that wasn't dimmed by streetlights. I've been camping since I was a kid, so the idea of getting away for a few days felt comforting to me, almost nostalgic. We prepared everything, set more or less a destination on the map, and 2 days later we were driving through the mountains toward the forest and the start of the trail we were going to hike. We parked near an old service road that barely looked used anymore, shouldered our packs, and headed uphill along a narrow path that eventually opened onto a ridge overlooking a valley full of leafless trees swaying like a gray ocean. Everything felt right at first, the kind of calm that makes you take deeper breaths without even noticing. And the silence had that honest, untouched quality that usually puts me at ease. I remember perfectly the look of happiness on my girlfriend's face, and I myself was extremely happy. Something in me was certain it was going to be an incredible time. I had no idea how wrong I was. Somewhere during the first afternoon, maybe an hour or so after we'd started hiking, I noticed what looked like someone standing way down the trail behind us. Not close and not approaching, just there. At first I thought it was just another hiker, maybe taking a break or looking at the view, but when I glanced back a second time, the shape was gone so quickly that I wasn't even sure I'd actually seen someone. Not that having someone there with us was necessarily strange, but I'll admit it's also not the most pleasant feeling in the world to be out in the middle of nowhere with a stranger. It's like a sense of vulnerability even when there's no apparent danger. I didn't want to worry my girlfriend over nothing, so I kept walking and tried to convince myself it had been a tree stump or a trick of the light, because that kind of thing happens all the time in the woods, especially when shadows start stretching out early in the day. We reached a spot near a small clearing that looked perfect for camp, with a fallen log we used as a seat and enough open ground to set up the tent comfortably. And as the sun dropped behind the hills, everything shifted into that familiar blue-gray gloom. Normally, those hours are my favorite part of camping because the cold air sharpens the sounds of the woods, and you can hear the distant crack of branches or the rustle of leaves like they're right next to you, sounds that have always managed to relax me. But that evening, I've always trusted too much in people's good intentions, and because of that, I sometimes end up in situations I wouldn't be in if I had stopped to think things through. So that uneasy feeling was unusual for me. I figured maybe it was because I was with my girlfriend and felt that extra responsibility, that need to make sure everything went right and that she didn't get hurt. When we finally crawled into the tent, I figured exhaustion would knock me out, but I kept waking up to the feeling that something outside wasn't moving the way animals usually do. It wasn't the familiar quick scurrying or the rhythmic pacing of deer. It was slower, more selective, like someone taking careful steps around the edges of our camp. Every time I peeked out, I saw nothing but darkness and the faint outline of trees moving in the wind, yet the feeling that someone was out there never fully faded. In the morning, my girlfriend mentioned that some of our gear looked like it had been shifted, not dramatically thrown around or disturbed, just subtly moved. Her water bottle wasn't where she remembered placing it, and the small mesh bag with our food was angled differently on the branch we hung it from. I told myself it could have been raccoons because that was the most rational explanation, but by then it already felt like too many coincidences piled on top of the feeling I'd had the whole night. I told her it was probably better if we didn't eat that food or drink that water, that we had enough inside the tent that we didn't need to touch any of that. I told her not to worry, that everything was fine, but I could still see a subtle change in her expression. We kept hiking deeper, partly because we thought more distance between us and the service road would make us feel safer, and partly because turning around so early felt premature. But the longer we walked, the more I couldn't shake the impression that we weren't alone, and at one point when I turned to check behind us, I caught the faintest flicker of movement far down the trail, too fast to identify, but just slow enough to confirm that someone was there and had been there for a while. With just one look, I told her to get behind me, and then I called out asking if someone was there and if they needed anything. I knew someone was, so the fact that they didn't answer felt like a confirmation that they didn't mean well. I yelled that we were both armed and that they needed to leave us alone. Then I simply motioned for my girlfriend to walk ahead of me while I kept moving, always looking back. By mid-afternoon, the tension had built so much that I finally admitted out loud that something was seriously wrong and that we needed to turn back immediately, no more second-guessing. She could see in my face that this wasn't just nerves, and even though neither of us wanted to admit how bad it felt, we both knew we weren't imagining it. The return hike was brutal because we had to backtrack the same narrow trail, knowing someone had been moving behind us on it earlier, and as the light started to fade faster than we expected, we realized we wouldn't make it back to the car before dark and would have to camp one more night whether we liked it or not. We found a spot near a cluster of boulders that offered at least one solid barrier at our back, and even though it wasn't ideal, it was the safest option we had. While we were setting up, my girlfriend froze mid-step and stared into the trees. She said she saw someone move, just a quick shift between two trunks like a person trying to blend into the shadows. When I looked, I didn't see anything, but the fact that she'd seen the same kind of movement I'd been noticing all day made my pulse climb in a way I couldn't hide anymore. We both knew we weren't alone, and we both knew we weren't going to sleep that night. We were going to stay on watch until sunrise. As dusk melted into full darkness, I saw them, two shapes standing completely still between the trees, far enough that I couldn't make out faces, but close enough that I could tell they were people. One was thin and tall, the kind of silhouette you'd almost mistake for a narrow tree if it weren't so perfectly upright. And the other was broader, heavier, someone with weight to their stance. One was thin and tall at 10, Hebe area, was thin and tall, was thin and tall. They didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even pretend to hide. I heard my girlfriend let out a sob like she was about to start crying, and I myself felt like I could cry too. It's a terrifying feeling having two people stalking you in the middle of nowhere, not knowing what their intentions are. Seeing them was scary, but at least now I knew where they were. I could point the gun at something real instead of just an impression. We stayed there all night, and several times I threatened that we had no problem using the gun we had with us, but they stayed there simply watching. The problem was that I was in full-blown panic. I had never pointed a gun at anyone in my life, and there's a huge difference between imagining and actually facing the moment where you might have to. Despite the freezing cold, we were both drenched in sweat from the stress. By morning, they were still there, and I could finally see their faces clearly. Only their eyes were visible. Both had thick beards and hats pulled low over their foreheads. I didn't know what to do. I was genuinely terrified. I had convinced myself that by sunrise they would have given up, but they had stood there all night, barely moving, watching us, and my whole body ached from the tension. And then something happened that felt like a miracle. Not far from us, we heard voices. The men heard them too. They glanced at each other and suddenly bolted. The relief hit me so hard I felt like I was going to pass out. I think the only thing that kept me upright was hearing my girlfriend start to cry. A mix of relief and the emotional collapse of realizing we had spent the entire night believing we were going to die out there. The voices got closer and then we saw them, 5 park rangers. I cried too from the sheer release of it all. They told us they were searching for a group of 3 friends who had gone missing the day before. More help was called in and we were both taken to the hospital, not because we were physically hurt, but because we were in shock and severely dehydrated. The missing friends were found 3 days later, but only 2 of them. They were terrified and hiding in a cave. They told the rangers they had been chased for hours by men they couldn't identify. The 3rd friend was never found. It was all over the news at the time, but nothing ever came of it. We were questioned repeatedly by the police and gave a full description of the 2 men, but to this day they've never been caught, and no one knows what happened to that missing kid. Everything I'm about to tell happened roughly a year ago, right at the beginning of the winter months. I remembered that the night it all happened, it was snowing, and driving on those roads had always made me uneasy. I live in a remote area of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but I work at a gas station that sits right off one of the busiest highways. I'm not going to say exactly where because I still work there. Like I said, that night it was snowing, and I still had a 42-minute drive home. I was working the first night shift, so I didn't get out of the station until around 2:30 a.m. It had been a relatively calm night until a man walked in and was extremely unpleasant to me. At first, he tried to make small talk like they all do, then moved on to saying I had good muscles and making comments about my body. I told him several times that I wasn't interested, that I had a girlfriend at home, and that he clearly wasn't my type, but he wouldn't stop. The more I pushed back, the more he insisted. At a certain point, he grabbed my wrist and tried to pull me toward him. I barely had time to reach for the gun I keep under the counter. He smiled in the most disgusting way, but he finally walked out. After about 5 minutes, I was relaxed again. After all, I was bigger than he was, and I was armed. I didn't think about it again until my co-worker for the next shift showed up and asked if everything had gone well. I was going to tell him at first, but then I figured it wasn't even worth it and just smiled and told him to watch out for creeps. When I walked outside, there were 3 vehicles: my car, my co-worker's car, and a work van a bit farther away that looked like it didn't have anyone inside. It had been a solid 45 minutes since anyone had walked into the gas station, so it struck me as a little strange. Still, I didn't give it more than a couple of seconds of thought. I got in my car because the cold was the kind that takes your breath away and headed home. Even though I had chains on the tires, the late hour and the low visibility turned what should have been a 42-minute drive into more than an hour. When I got home, all I wanted was a quick shower before collapsing into bed. Up until that moment, I hadn't noticed anything wrong. It had been a night like any other. But while I was in the shower, I heard a noise that startled me. It came from inside the house. It sounded like something breaking, but I wasn't absolutely sure. I stayed completely still for several seconds, my heartbeat speeding up while I tried to listen carefully. After a couple of minutes, I calmed myself down, assuming it had been my cat, Mia, knocking something over. Only when I stepped out of the shower did I realize the bathroom door was closed and she was in there with me. It couldn't have been her. I finished drying off and getting dressed, and when I left the bathroom, I went through the rooms one by one to see what could have made the noise. The air felt tense, and even Mia was tense, as if she were ready to see something she absolutely didn't want to see. Just around the corner, her fur was puffed up, and she reacted to every tiny sound. The house felt darker than it had ever felt before, even with the lights on. As I entered each room, there was this overwhelming sense of isolation, a feeling that wasn't inaccurate at all, considering I was miles from the nearest house. Downstairs, right at the bottom of the stairs, I saw a broken vase. That must have been the noise I heard while I was in the shower. I didn't believe it had fallen on its own, but I desperately wanted to believe it had, that it had simply been too close to the edge and slipped. I kept moving slowly through the house, the hair on my arms standing straight up. Then I saw on top of the couch a set of clothes. I don't know how long it took me to process the fact that someone was naked in my house. I only know it shocked me completely because of how bizarre the situation felt. I didn't need the clothes to know exactly who it was, but how could he have followed me if I hadn't seen a single car behind me the entire drive? I peeked out the window. There was no car on the street, and I was completely isolated. More than scared, I was furious. I grabbed Mia, mostly afraid that creep would hurt her, then ran to the bedroom to get the gun I kept there. I didn't know where he was. The last thing I wanted was a fight, especially with him being naked. I also didn't know whether he was armed. The moment I stepped into the bedroom, heading straight for the gun, I knew where he was. He was in the room with me, shoved into the closet. The closet door was slightly open, barely pushed in, and when I walked in, I saw something shift inside, just slightly, as if he were adjusting to the surprise of me entering suddenly. Everything clicked at once. I was going to screw that creep over. At that point, I knew he didn't want to confront me, otherwise he would have done it already. He wanted to catch me while I was vulnerable, asleep, without logically walking through a plan. But knowing I had one, I grabbed my phone and pretended to call a friend, supposedly someone about to drop something off for me, and who would take about 10 minutes to get to my house. That would give me just enough time to lock the guy inside the room and call the police without him suspecting anything until it was too late. I grabbed the comforter from the bed, the gun, and the AC remote, then walked out of the room and locked the door behind me. Mia was much more relaxed now, as if she could feel my calm. The moment I locked the door, I sat her down and turned the air conditioning on full blast, freezing cold. It was like everything had lined up perfectly. That wasn't the room I normally used. It was the storage room with no windows where I didn't keep my clothes. I suffer from migraines, and sometimes they get so bad I can't handle any light at all. That windowless, stimulus-free room is ideal, and I'd been sleeping in it for about 3 days because I'd recently had a really bad migraine. I hadn't switched back to my main bedroom yet simply because I was lazy and hadn't changed the sheets. On top of that, the closet in that room held my parents' belongings, things that meant something to me and that I didn't want to get rid of after they died. The only bedding in that room was the one I'd brought out of it, meaning he was naked in a windowless room in the dead of winter with the AC blasting ice-cold air. The room was tiny, so in less than 5 minutes, it would feel like a freezer. That night is both the scariest of my life because of how bizarre it all was, and also one of the nights I'm most proud of myself, knowing that in a moment like that, I not only kept a cool head but managed to outsmart him completely. I waited a full 5 minutes before calling the police. I wanted him practically frozen when they arrived, but after 5 minutes he was already screaming, begging me to open the door, running around the room trying to stay warm. I don't think I can fully express how entertained I was. When the police arrived, 33 minutes after I called, things got even better when I told them what I had done. The older officer even said that in all his years on the job, he had never come across a story like that. The man was taken away, first to the hospital to stabilize his temperature, then to the police station. The trial is still ongoing, but I know he won't be getting out anytime soon. And the best part is that every time he sees me in the courtroom, I can see a slight trembling in him, like he's afraid of me. I believe that even if he walked free tomorrow, he wouldn't have the guts to get near me or to harass anyone else ever again. I've spent most of my life tucked somewhere along the Appalachian Mountains, moving between small towns and back roads that barely show up on maps. Out here, you learn pretty fast that the weather decides everything, and the land has its own mood that you either respect or you get burned by. I've always liked that balance. The isolation, the quiet, the way the world feels honest when you're this far from everything. I've dealt with storms, power outages, washed out roads, wildlife getting too close. Nothing about that ever bothered me. What did bother me was this one night I'm about to talk about. A night that still sits somewhere in the back of my mind, whether I want it or not. It was supposed to be one of those simple, harmless weekends at my cabin, something I've done 100 times without a second thought. But instead, it turned into one of the most unsettling nights I've ever lived through. The kind that makes you rethink how safe you really are out here, no matter how familiar the woods feel. That night, the storm was already tearing through the ridge long before the sun went down. The kind of storm that makes every tree groan and every gust of wind shake the whole cabin like it's made of cardboard. My friends from town had planned to stay with me for 2 days. Nothing fancy, just a quiet weekend out in the mountains. But they called me before it even hit 8,000 saying they weren't coming up. Honestly, I didn't blame them. Driving through those mountain roads with almost no visibility would have been asking for trouble. However, the disappointment hit me harder than I expected. I'd been looking forward to having people around for once, but instead it turned into one of those nights where all I could do was worry about my property. Living out here has way more advantages than drawbacks, but the drawbacks, when they show up, can get dangerous fast: flash floods, landslides, trees falling, and each time something expensive gets destroyed. After dinner, I checked the security cameras just to see if anything outside was visible at all. It wasn't. The rain was so heavy the lenses were basically fogged white. I tossed my phone aside and put on a movie I've watched probably 500 times. It's my go-to when I'm too wired to sit in silence and I don't want to think about whatever's bothering me. I'd gotten maybe 30 minutes into it when I heard knocking at the front door. It wasn't dramatic or anything, just a solid knock, but it put every muscle in my body on alert immediately. Out here in the middle of a storm, on a night like that, nobody knocks. I don't have any neighbors, and I'm way too far from any trail. If you hear knocking in this kind of isolation, something's wrong. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed of the front entrance. Nothing, not even a shadow. I walked to the door as quietly as I could, looked through the peephole and saw the same thing: nobody. For a second, I wondered if I imagined it. But the sound had been clear enough that I knew I hadn't. I tried to shake it off and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water, and that's when I froze. Pressed right up against the kitchen door window was a man wearing one of the most unsettling masks I'd ever seen. He hadn't spotted me yet, but I could see him tugging gently at the back door handle, testing it like he was trying to find a quiet way in. My first thought was that he'd knocked on the front door to distract me while he came around back. Then another thought hit me just as fast. What if there was more than one of them? I ran to the bedroom, grabbed my gun, and rushed back toward the kitchen, ready to scare him off, or worse if I had to. But when I got there, he was already gone. I checked every door and window in the house, then double-checked everything was locked and solid. After that, I sat with my phone and watched the camera feeds like my life depended on it. The storm was so heavy that even the motion-detecting cameras weren't catching anything except sheets of rain. I kept watching anyway, barely blinking, trying to convince myself he'd left. 30 minutes passed without a single noise, and I finally started to think the guy had given up. I was seconds away from letting myself calm down when I heard glass shatter from upstairs. It was sharp, fast, and loud enough that it cut right through the storm. He was inside. It didn't make much sense at first because every window upstairs was reinforced and double-paned, solid enough that breaking in through any of them would have made a hell of a lot more noise. Then it hit me, the small roof window that opened into the attic. I hadn't thought about that window in years, mostly because the attic had been shut off for so long, and not just shut, literally sealed. When I ran upstairs to confirm what I already suspected, it was almost a relief to hear his footsteps pounding around up there. It meant he hadn't made it into the actual house. Years earlier, when I first moved into that cabin, I got it for way cheaper than it should have sold for. People in town whispered all kinds of stories about it. Said you could hear footsteps upstairs at night. Said anyone who lived there long enough ended up dead because of some vengeful spirit trapped in the house. I didn't believe any of that crap. I thought I was just getting a great deal. But the truth is, during those first weeks, I learned the hard way that something was actually wrong. I heard footsteps at night, not the usual creaking wood, but steady, deliberate steps. One night, I woke up in full panic, convinced someone was standing in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shape in the corner, a dark, hunched shadow that disappeared the second I turned the light on. I knew I wasn't imagining it, so I called a local woman people swore by, someone who supposedly dealt with whatever you want to call this stuff. The moment she stepped inside the attic, she told me flat out she couldn't get rid of the spirit. Said it wasn't wandering the house like a ghost, it was attached to the attic, bound to it, angry, and the only real option was trapping it inside so it couldn't spread anywhere else. She told me to line the doorway with salt and silver and keep the attic permanently shut. I did everything she said, but I'm a suspicious person by nature. I didn't trust that a bit of salt and metal would keep something like that contained, so I hired a guy to seal the entire attic door with actual cement. After that, I still heard footsteps from time to time, but I never had another real problem until that night. The man outside must have come through the only entrance that wasn't sealed, that tiny roof window. I heard him pacing like a trapped animal, frantic footsteps racing back and forth. Then suddenly a short, muffled sound cut through the floorboards. It wasn't a scream exactly, but it was sharp, startled, almost panicked. It was the kind of sound someone makes when they see something they weren't expecting. I didn't know what he'd stumbled into up there. Old beams, loose boards, the pitch black dark, but whatever it was, it scared him badly enough that I heard him scrambling toward the roof window again. Within seconds, I heard him climbing out the same way he came in, a couple of thuds, and then nothing but the storm. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to it move around above me, whatever the hell lives in that attic. It paced back and forth for hours, heavy steps dragging across the beams like it was unsettled by what had happened. A couple of times I caught myself wondering if it might have slipped out through the window after the guy escaped, but the noises never stopped. It was still up there, still trapped. Maybe the silver lining on the window frame actually did its job. I don't know, I'm not an expert in any of this. I just know that whatever was in my attic stayed where it was supposed to. I still don't know what's in this house with me. Not really, but I do know one thing. That night, for the first time since I moved in, I was actually grateful I wasn't alone in here. What I'm about to tell you happened more than 15 years ago, but it's something I still think about every single year, especially in December when I end up making the same drive where it all happened. I had been on the road for nearly 9 hours, driving from North Carolina up to West Virginia to spend Christmas with my family. It was a trip I made almost every year, usually without incident, but that afternoon, the weather reports had started flashing warnings about a sudden winter storm pushing across the mountains. I saw the alert while I was already halfway through the state, and instead of doing the smart thing, pulling over somewhere safe and waiting it out, I convinced myself I could beat it. I kept thinking about how close I was, less than 2 hours from home. I told myself it would be stupid to stop now, stupid to pay for a motel when my own bed was waiting for me. That decision, which felt small and harmless at the time, turned into one of the biggest mistakes of my life. The deeper I drove into the mountains, the darker it became. The sun dropped faster than I expected, swallowed by clouds that looked like they were tearing across the sky. It wasn't even snowing heavily yet, but the wind was brutal, violent enough that I could feel it pushing against the side of my car, shoving me a few inches across the lane whenever I passed through exposed stretches of highway. Every time the road curved around an open ridge, it felt like I could lose control entirely. My hands were locked on the wheel, knuckles stiff, stomach clenched. I kept telling myself to turn around, go back the 40 minutes to the last little town I'd passed. But I knew 40 minutes in normal weather meant more than an hour now, and every mile I drove deeper into those mountains made going backward more impossible. But driving forward didn't feel much more possible either. I had put myself in a corridor with no exits. It wasn't panic yet, not at first, but every old story I'd heard growing up about people freezing to death in their cars started pulling at the edges of my mind. It's not an uncommon fear if you grow up in a place like that. You hear things, you learn what can happen to people who make stupid decisions on winter nights. I was one of those people now. By the time the sky went fully black, the snow had thickened into a steady curtain, and I had slowed to a crawl. I'd long since given up trying to track the road by any kind of visibility. I was following the vague glow of my headlights against the edges of the guardrails and praying I didn't drift too far. Eventually, I had no choice but to pull over completely. I checked my phone again, still no service. I cursed myself repeatedly, genuinely angry at how arrogant I'd been. I'd put off buying a satellite phone for years, even though I drove through remote areas all the time. I'd convinced myself it wasn't necessary, convinced myself I knew these mountains like the back of my hand. I sat there in the dark, heartbeat thudding in my ears, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. The wind rocked the car, snow piled slowly around the tires, and my mind kept circling the same thought. If this car dies, I die with it. I was still staring into that pitch-black road when faint lights appeared far behind me, headlights cutting through the storm. I've never felt relief hit that hard. It was like every nerve in my body jumped awake at once, but right behind that relief came a sliver of doubt. Out here, people are careful, suspicious. Most drivers don't stop for strangers in storms, not because they're cruel, but because they've learned to be cautious. And if this car passed me by, I didn't know what I'd do. Still, I wasn't letting the chance slip by. I forced my stiff legs to move, opened the door, and stepped out into the storm. The cold slapped me instantly, but I waved my arms anyway, hoping, begging that the driver would notice. To my shock, the vehicle slowed immediately. It was a big truck, clearly made for winter roads like these, and the driver lowered the window as he pulled up beside me. Something felt wrong with him the moment I saw his face. Not anything specific, nothing I could point to, just that instinctive twist in the gut that tells you a person isn't quite right. A kind of wrongness that you can't logically justify but also can't ignore. But logic didn't matter. My options were to get in or freeze to death. He started talking right away. Not the quiet, cautious type of man you expect to meet on a mountain road at night. If anything, he was too talkative, too cheerful, the kind of person who forces friendliness into every sentence, filling the air with an energy that feels manufactured, like he was trying to preemptively convince me that everything was fine before I'd even had time to think otherwise. I answered him politely, keeping my tone neutral, but something about the conversation unsettled me. His questions weren't strange on the surface. Where I was coming from, where I was headed, who I was spending the holidays with. But the way he circled around them felt intentional, like he wanted to confirm whether or not someone was expecting me soon, whether or not someone would come looking if I didn't show up. The question that tipped me from uneasy to alarmed came when he asked if the people waiting for me knew exactly where I was, not just that I was nearby, but whether they knew I was here right now on this road, in this storm, in this truck with him. My pulse kicked up hard. He must have seen something change in my eyes because his expression shifted just slightly. I told him they did, that I had been sharing my location the whole drive, that my dad and brother were already on the road toward me. None of it was true. Nobody knew anything. He didn't like my answer. He kept his expression neutral, but I felt the temperature in the cab drop, not physically, but in that subtle, unmistakable way someone reacts when a plan they were forming suddenly hits a snag. I told myself I might be overreacting, that the storm and darkness were making me paranoid, but that lie collapsed the minute he made a turn I knew was wrong. He should have gone left. The nearest town was left. I knew those roads intimately. I'd grown up here. To the right, there were only scattered cabins, hunting land, and long stretches of nothing. I had once gotten lost on that same road as a teenager and had never forgotten it. I asked why we turned, and he gave a smooth explanation about an alternate route, a safer one during storms, the kind of answer that would have convinced me if I didn't know better. I pretended to buy it. I even thanked him. I watched his shoulders loosen just barely. My lie was working. But now I had no plan, and I needed one fast. Jumping out of the moving truck wasn't an option. Running into the woods would kill me faster than he could. The only remotely possible strategy was to catch him off guard and use something, anything in that truck against him. I figured a man like him, driving through the mountains at night, probably had tools, maybe snow gear, maybe even weapons. The back of that truck was my only hope. He hesitated, suggested. I wait, said we were close. I told him I couldn't, that I had a medical issue. Eventually he pulled over. The moment the truck slowed, I bolted toward the back. I prayed the storage compartment was unlocked. It was. In the second it took me to lift the door, I heard him shout and start coming after me, but I'd been faster. My hand closed around the first thing large enough to defend myself, a shotgun. He reached me just as I turned. I brought the butt of the gun up and slammed it into the side of his head, harder than I meant to. My heart was hammering. For a moment, I just stood there staring at him, sprawled unconscious in the snow, trying to piece together what the hell to do next. The contents of the truck didn't make me feel better. Fuel cans, rope, duct tape, random junk shoved into bags with no clear purpose. Practical items for the mountains, sure, but also the kind of things you'd expect to see in a true crime documentary about a killer's kit. A sliver of doubt tried to wedge itself into my mind. Maybe he really had just been a weird but harmless local. But no, him turning down that road had told me everything I needed to know. I found rope and tied him to the back seat of his own truck. I wasn't an expert, but I'd been a Boy Scout long enough to know how to make a knot that wouldn't come loose. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to focus, to get into the driver's seat, to start the truck, to point it back toward home. The drive felt endless. Every bump made me think he might wake up. Every shadow made me think he'd get free. Every silence made me fear I'd made a massive mistake and was about to be the one arrested. I called my brother when I got close enough to pick up a signal, voice shaking as I told him I needed help. He didn't hesitate. He was already outside when I pulled into my parents' driveway. He took one look at the man tied in the back and recognized him instantly. He said the guy was a carpenter from the area and that a tourist had accused him of attempted kidnapping a couple years back. Nothing had come of it officially, but the story had spread enough that most locals kept their distance from him. Some believed the tourist, some didn't, but everyone agreed the man gave off a bad feeling. My brother said we'd drive him somewhere secluded and leave him there with a warning, one written clearly enough that he wouldn't misunderstand. A threat I hated making, but at that point I understood too well how close I'd come to disappearing in those mountains. For days afterward, I expected a knock on the door, or the police showing up, or the man himself coming back for revenge. None of that happened. 15 years have passed now. I still won't drive mountain roads in bad weather, and I never heard another thing about him. But every year around Christmas when I'm driving home again, I think about that night, those dark roads, that storm, that man, and I remind myself how easily everything could have ended differently. About 6 years ago, I went through one of the scariest experiences of my life. I've lived in West Virginia my whole life, and I'm used to being out in remote areas, reading the woods and keeping myself safe without much help. Still, nothing I'd learned out there ever prepared me for how strange everything was, and you'll see what I mean by strange, because that's exactly how it felt. And even now, I don't have any real explanation for it. My family owns a small cabin tucked deep in the mountains, completely isolated from everything. It's nothing fancy, and definitely not the kind of place you'd want to spend months living in, but it's been in my family since my grandparents were young, and I've always felt responsible for keeping it standing. I live in the city, so I only get to visit it every now and then, usually just long enough to do a few repairs and remind myself why I love the place. 6 years back, I changed jobs. The schedule was strange, 6 months of non-stop work followed by 6 months completely off. It wasn't ideal having all my free time in the dead of winter, but after working year-round for so long, I wasn't about to complain. Plus, winter meant I finally had the chance to spend long stretches of time at the cabin and slowly fix what had been falling apart, all while doing my favorite thing, spending whole evenings reading by the fireplace. It was my first time staying there for more than a weekend, and instead of being nervous, I was genuinely excited. I pictured myself lighting the fireplace every night, reading for hours, actually relaxing for the first time in years. When the weather cleared, I planned to take long hikes through the ridge trails I grew up exploring. There were so many possibilities that I drove up the mountain that first day, feeling happier than I had in a long time. The first 2 weeks were rough, I won't lie. The cabin was in worse shape than I remembered. The nights were bone cold, and during heavy rain, 2 different spots leaked badly enough that I had to set buckets down. I made trip after trip to the nearest town for tools, insulation, and cheap lumber, slowly turning the place into something I could tolerate. Even with how exhausting it was, I enjoyed it. The isolation didn't bother me at all. If anything, it felt good to be away from everything for once, and during those first couple of weeks, nothing felt strange. Nothing seemed out of place. Everything was exactly how it should be. Until one particular afternoon, I came back to the cabin after a long haul of materials, and that was when things started slipping sideways. The air outside carried that thin, cutting chill that shows up when the weather's getting ready to turn. Yet, the second I opened the door, I felt a cold inside that almost outmatched the one outside. It hit me in a flat, steady wave, the kind that didn't make sense for a room that had been locked up all day. My first thought was that maybe I hadn't closed the door properly before leaving, but the latch was still in place. I stepped inside anyway, rubbing my hands together while I tried not to think too much. The place looked normal at first glance, just as messy as I'd left it. Then I spotted a single glass on the counter, still wet inside. I was almost certain I'd washed every dish that morning and left them all upside down on the old towel near the sink. I just stood there a moment, staring at that one glass like it was supposed to explain something to me, but after a full day of hauling boards and driving up and down the mountain, the last thing I wanted was to create problems out of nothing. So I chalked it up to exhaustion and moved on. Even so, the whole cabin felt off. I walked around with that weight in my chest. Every corner I looked at felt like it had just been vacated. Still, after walking the place a couple of times and finding everything else in its place, I convinced myself that the cold was probably sneaking in through one of the spots I hadn't patched yet. The place had so many gaps that sometimes I joked the cabin breathed more than I did. I tried letting the whole thing go. I lit the fireplace, made a quick dinner, and settled on the couch with the book I'd been dragging around for weeks. The fire took the edge off the cold pretty fast, and after an hour or two, the crackling and the smell of burning wood had me fully relaxed. The book turned out to be better than I'd expected, and the quiet of the mountains made it easy to fall into the story. For a while, I forgot all about the glass, the cold, the strange feeling of being watched. It must have been close to midnight when I heard what sounded like a cabinet door easing open. It wasn't loud, just that soft wooden shift that happens when hinges move slow. I froze with the book still in my hand. A few seconds later, I heard it again, a little clearer this time. It came from the direction of the bedroom, and suddenly, that old wave of unease came crashing back even heavier than before. I tried to tell myself it could have been the woods settling or some draft pushing on a loose hinge, but the truth was, I'd lived in that cabin long enough to know every sound it made. This wasn't one of them. The silence that followed was worse because it felt deliberate, like someone waiting me out. I know it sounds like a strange thing to say, but that's exactly what I felt, an oppressive kind of silence. I finally stood up, grabbed one of the kitchen knives, and went through the whole place corner by corner. I checked the bathroom, the bedroom, the closet, even the crawl space under the bed. By the time I pulled down the ladder to peek into the tiny attic, my hands were shaking so badly I had to take a breath before climbing up. The attic was empty, just the old trunks and boxes my grandfather had stuffed up there decades ago. It didn't take long to search the entire cabin, yet I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in there with me. The logical part of me kept repeating that there wasn't a single piece of evidence proving anything, and eventually that became enough to at least calm me down a little. I thought about sleeping in the car just in case, but the temperature had dropped so much that I knew I'd be miserable, so I convinced myself the isolation was getting into my head and went back to the couch, trying to act like nothing had happened. Reading was out of the question, so I pulled out my phone and started a movie I downloaded earlier. It worked better than I expected. Within half an hour, the anxiety faded just enough for my body to give in to exhaustion, and I fell asleep without even noticing. What woke me later was a mix of heat on my face and a jolt of panic that didn't come from any dream. I shot upright, and the first thing I saw was the fireplace. The flames were still going strong, high enough that the shadows were moving across the walls. I knew for a fact that when I'd put the movie on, the last log had been almost burned through. There shouldn't have been any fire left at all. Then I noticed the 2 fresh logs sitting in the flames. Someone had added them. Someone had been moving around while I slept on the couch just a few feet away. My body reacted faster than my thoughts did. I stood up so quickly I nearly tripped, and that's when I saw him. He was sitting at the far end of the same couch I'd been sleeping on, perfectly still, his posture stiff. His face was dimly lit by the fire, and his eyes were fixed on the flames like he hadn't even noticed me wake up. I couldn't tell you what happened in the next few seconds. Everything blurred together. The shock, the cold spike of terror running up my spine, the instinct to run so strong it felt like it hollowed me out. I don't know if he looked at me or said anything or even moved. All I remember clearly is the moment my hands hit the steering wheel of my car, and I realized I was already halfway down the mountain road. As soon as I got a signal, I called the police. I was out of breath and probably not making much sense, but I told them everything. The dispatcher sounded skeptical, but eventually said they'd send someone to check it out. The officers went through the cabin in barely 10 minutes. They joked, asked if I'd been drinking, if I'd taken anything, if I had a history of mental issues. Every word made me feel smaller and more embarrassed, but none of it changed what I'd seen. They didn't find anyone, didn't find any sign of forced entry, and left acting like I'd wasted their time. I left right behind them, and the last thing I heard was one of them laughing before the cruiser door shut. I haven't been back since. I don't know who he was or how long he'd been inside while I slept, and I don't think I want to know. Even now, I still check every room in my house before going to bed, and there are nights when I lie awake wondering what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did. I lived my entire life in the Appalachian Mountains, and my entire life I learned how to deal with things most people don't even imagine exist. I'm writing this now because what happened last New Year's Eve in 2024 brought back something I hadn't thought about in decades, something I first saw when I was a kid and tried to tell everyone about only to be dismissed as having an overactive imagination. Back then, I eventually convinced myself that maybe they were right, that memory softens and reshapes things, especially when you grow up surrounded by forest shadows and stories that seem to bleed into real life. But last year erased that comfort completely, and now in 2025, as I get ready to spend New Year's Eve alone in this same house, I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was didn't disappear, it just waited. I grew up in a house tucked into the mountains, far enough from town that the forest felt like part of the property, not something that began at a clear edge. Trees surrounded us on all sides, dense and old, and at night the darkness felt heavier there, thicker somehow. As a kid, I learned early to recognize the normal sounds, the wind through the branches, owls calling to each other, deer moving through brush, and even predators passing through once in a while. But there was one night when I was about 9 years old when I saw something that didn't fit into any of those categories. It was exactly New Year's Eve, back when the night itself wasn't really celebrated, and all the importance was placed on January 1st instead. I remember waking up late, unable to sleep, and looking out my bedroom window toward the tree line where the porch light barely reached. I saw a shape moving slowly at the edge of the forest, not walking the way animals do, not darting or cautious. It stayed just far enough back that the darkness hid most of it, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't small. I remember the way it seemed to lean forward, like it was studying the house, and how it moved sideways instead of straight on. I watched it move around for a while, and I wasn't really scared at first, not until the moment it started getting closer to the house. Back then, I was just a kid, and I didn't understand fear the way I do now, so instead of hiding, I simply opened the window and yelled something out loud. The creature lifted its head, looked straight into my eyes, and then disappeared back into the trees. I remember that the scene itself shook me so deeply that I spent the entire night trembling from the cold, as if no matter how many blankets I piled on, it didn't matter because the cold wasn't around me, it was inside me. I told my parents the next morning, told my grandparents, told anyone who would listen, and everyone brushed it off as a dream or a deer standing on uneven ground or my imagination filling in gaps. Even my grandparents, who had spent my entire childhood telling me terrifying stories about the mountains, were the ones who told me to drop it, forget the whole thing, and stop talking about it altogether. After a while, I stopped talking about it at all. That is, until last year. New Year's Eve of 2024 was supposed to be simple and comforting with the whole family packed into the house like we had done so many times before. The kitchen was full, the TV was on, people were laughing, and outside the cold had settled deep into the mountains, the kind of cold that makes the forest go quiet. Somewhere around mid-evening, I started feeling off, not sharply sick, but heavy, achy, like something was coming on. My head felt warm, my stomach uneasy, and the noise around me started to feel like too much, so I decided to lie down for a bit, figuring I'd rest my eyes and rejoin everyone before midnight. I went into my bedroom, closed the door, and lay down fully dressed, listening to the muffled sounds of my family through the walls. For a while, I drifted in and out, that strange half-sleep where thoughts blur together, and then I felt that familiar sense of alertness that comes before you realize you're not alone, even when you technically are. I opened my eyes, convinced that someone was there to wake me up and tell me it was time to go downstairs, but there was no one there. I lay still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness of the room and trying to understand why I'd woken up so suddenly. And then, without really knowing how or why, I turned my head toward the window, as if some part of me already knew that something was there. At first I saw nothing unusual, just darkness and the faint reflection of the room behind me. Then something moved, something emerged from between the trees, exactly where I had seen it as a child. My body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with fever. The shape was larger than a person and wrong in its proportions, too long in some places, too narrow in others, and it didn't fully step into the open. It stayed near the edge of the forest, circling slightly as if it understood the limits of the light and chose not to cross them. I stayed frozen, watching as it moved along the perimeter of the yard, not approaching directly, not retreating either, just drifting from one side to the other. What unsettled me most wasn't its size or its movement, but the sense that it knew exactly where everyone was inside the house, where the noise was coming from, where the warmth was. I felt an overwhelming urge to open the window and speak to that thing again, but before I could even move, it lifted its head toward my window, locked its gaze onto mine, and then simply slipped back into the trees the same way it had come out, swallowed by the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I don't remember how long I stayed there afterward, staring at the empty space, shaking from the cold or from something else entirely. But eventually the sounds of my family pulled me back, and I forced myself up, rejoined them, and said nothing. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen because I already knew how that story ended. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I barely slept at all. Every small noise made me tense, every shadow felt heavier than it should have. When morning came, I felt drained, like I had spent the night running instead of lying still. Now it's the end of 2025, and for the first time, I'm spending New Year's Eve alone in this house. The family is scattered this year, plans changed, life got in the way, and I told myself I didn't mind. But as that night approaches, I keep finding myself drawn to the windows, checking the tree line, watching the edge where the light fades. I don't know what I saw when I was a child, and I don't know what I saw last year, but I know it was the same thing, and I can't stop thinking that whatever that thing was is going to come back for me, that it's been waiting all these years for the same night just for a moment when it could find me alone. It's only a feeling, nothing I can prove, but it's a feeling strong enough to leave me absolutely terrified. What I'm about to tell you Happened at the start of winter in 2001 up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I still feel a knot in my stomach every time I think about it, not because I enjoy revisiting it, but because that trip forced me to understand just how quickly a quiet stretch of woods can turn into something you're not prepared for. Back then, I wasn't doing great mentally, and being alone outdoors had always helped me clear my head, so I told myself a few days deep in the mountains would help me reset. I'd camped dozens of times before, including winter trips, and even though the cold was creeping in earlier that year, I figured as long as I stayed smart and kept my gear dry, I'd be fine. I parked at a trailhead I'd used once with a friend, shouldered my pack, and headed out in that heavy silence that only early winter brings, the kind where even your footsteps sound like they're trying not to bother anybody. The first day went smoothly enough, long stretches of trail without seeing anyone, just the sound of wind pushing through bare branches and the occasional creak of a tree shifting under its own weight sounds that actually always managed to relax me. I set up camp on a flat patch near a line of pines and fell asleep without feeling even slightly uneasy, which now feels almost ridiculous considering what was waiting for me. The next morning, I moved deeper along the ridge, planning to circle around and camp in a different spot each night, and around midday I stopped to adjust one of the straps on my pack. As I stepped off the trail to lean the pack against a tree, something caught my foot, not enough to trip me, just a quick sharp tug that made me jerk backward instinctively. When I looked down, I realized I'd brushed over a thin line of wire that stretched from one sapling to another, almost invisible unless the sun hit it just right. It wasn't connected to anything obvious, but it wasn't some random piece of debris either. Someone had placed it there on purpose. I stared at it for a long minute, trying to decide if it was meant for an animal or possibly some leftover from an old campsite that someone forgot to take down. After all, it was almost invisible at a glance. Yeah, that had to be it. So, I told myself not to overreact and kept going, even though that small wire nagged at the back of my mind for the rest of the day. A few years back, there had been a story about several traps found in the woods, traps made to catch people, but it felt unreal that I might have actually come across one. By late afternoon, I found another decent spot and set up camp again, this time closer to a rocky incline that in my head made the area feel safer, like having a wall at my back reduced the number of directions anything or anyone could come from. I cooked a small dinner while the sun went down behind the ridge, and as the temperature dropped, I crawled into my tent with that lingering thought about the wire still scratching at my nerves. I didn't sleep well, waking up a few times to adjust my bag or listen to the wind, but nothing strange happened during the night. The second thing I found was the one that shifted my mindset from uncomfortable to genuinely concerned. It was late the next morning, maybe around 10,000. I'd wandered off the trail a little to look for a spot to have a quick lunch. I saw a disturbed patch of ground, leaves brushed aside, dirt that looked freshly kicked up, and when I crouched down to check it, I saw another wire. But this one led to a bent sapling held under tension. It was a classic snare setup, except larger than anything I had ever seen. If someone stepped into it, the loop would tighten around their leg, and the tree would snap back with enough force to drag them sideways. At least the more I looked at it, the more it seemed like that was exactly what was going to happen. It wasn't lethal, but it was designed to injure someone badly or keep them trapped until whoever said it came back. That's the detail that made my skin crawl. This wasn't sloppy and it wasn't improvised. Someone had put real time into it. I didn't linger. I backed away carefully, made my way straight to camp, and started packing up right then and there. I figured the smartest thing to do was hike out early the next morning, but I wanted to get a couple miles between me and that spot before dark. The whole walk that afternoon felt wrong. Every time I stopped to sip water or adjust something, the woods felt hostile, something I had never felt before out in nature. By the time I set up camp for the third night, I was already on edge, but I kept telling myself that I was being paranoid, that maybe a hunter had set the snares recklessly, that maybe I was just spooking myself. There are so many people in this world with so little compassion or sense of responsibility. Maybe it really was just that. Someone stupid enough to set it up while hunting and then forget about it. But at the same time, the fact that there were fresh marks in the area where the wire was made me uneasy. It had rained, so if it had been set up more than a day ago, the marks would probably have already disappeared. It made me extremely tense to think that someone had been around there, close enough to set those things up, but far enough away that I couldn't see them. That night, I made a quick dinner and wanted to get into the tent as soon as possible, but I placed some leaves and sticks around it before crawling in. If someone was nearby and tried to get close, I would have time to hear them and react. Around midnight, I woke up to the faint sound of fabric shifting. At first, I thought it was wind pushing the tent, But then I realized the noise was too controlled, too slow. It wasn't the tent moving, it was the zipper being tested. Just a tiny pull-up, like someone trying to figure out how quietly they could open it. My whole body went rigid. I could hear breathing outside, not loud, but close. And then soft footsteps circling. I didn't say anything, didn't even breathe for several seconds. When the zipper moved again, I snapped, lunging forward and yelling as I kicked the door outward through the fabric. Something or someone stumbled backward, and I heard fast, heavy footfalls tearing through the brush. I scrambled out of the tent with my flashlight shaking in my hand and caught a glimpse between the trees, a person with something blinking in their hand like they were holding a phone and recording me with it. That was enough for me. I rushed back, ripped the tent down in seconds, shoved whatever I could carry into my pack and started down the trail, shouting that I was armed and had no problem using my weapon on anyone who tried to hurt me. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, but adrenaline kept me moving. I walked as fast as I could, but without compromising my safety. I didn't take a single step without checking the ground first and making sure I wasn't about to fall into a trap. If I did, I knew that could very well be the end of me. The night was bitter and quiet, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional snap of a branch far behind me, which I prayed was an animal even though I didn't believe it. After almost an hour of walking, I stopped and turned off my light to listen. At first, I heard nothing but the wind, and then, faint but unmistakable, I heard someone stepping through leaves, matching my pauses, keeping distance but not losing me. I forced myself to move steadily instead of sprinting because the last thing I needed was to twist an ankle in the dark. The trail wound down the slope and eventually widened, and when the sky began to lighten, I finally let myself believe I might be getting out. A couple miles later, I reached a ranger service road and followed it until I saw a parked truck. I didn't knock. I banged on the window until the ranger inside startled awake. Once I told him everything, he sat me in the truck to warm up while he radioed 2 other rangers. They took me back to my car first, then hiked in to check the areas I described. They found my destroyed tent and the spots where the traps had been, but the traps themselves were gone, removed cleanly. Something that still unsettles me to this day is that while we were in the truck driving back toward my car, the ranger told me something that still bothers me to this day. He said my report wasn't an isolated one. I asked him what he meant by that, and he said there was an active investigation going on, but he wasn't authorized to talk about it. Needless to say, they never told me anything more, and I never saw a single report in the newspapers or anywhere else. They never found the man, and I never camped alone again. What I'm about to tell you happened entirely because of my own stupidity, and I say that with full awareness. I had way too much confidence in myself back then, and honestly acted like an idiot. I was young, stuck in that stage of life where you really believe bad things only happen to other people. And because of that, I walked straight into a situation I never should have been in. I live in Pennsylvania in this tiny mountain town with barely any people and barely any houses. And everybody is spread out across the hillside in a way that sometimes makes you feel like you're the only person left on earth. That kind of isolation can be a blessing or a curse depending on your mood. And the day I woke up on the wrong side of everything. I was depressed, restless, drifting from room to room, picking things up and putting them down, starting tasks and forgetting about them seconds later. When I get like that, the only thing that helps is stepping outside. My plan that morning was just to take a short walk to clear my head, nothing more than that. But it ended up becoming one of the most terrifying days of my life, because I thought it was going to be a quick walk, and my mood was already lousy. I completely forgot that I was stepping into land that wasn't mine, land full of wildlife, and God knows what else. I just walked out the door without anything except a bottle of water and an apple. I started off wandering along the areas I knew well, the trails that wrap around my property and that I'd walked more times than I could count. I knew those paths like the back of my hand, and I guess that familiarity put my brain on autopilot. The chaos in my head mixed with the comfort of the surroundings, and I just kept walking without really thinking about where I was going. I didn't snap out of that weird meditative trance until I found myself standing in front of a cabin I didn't recognize. I checked my watch and realized I'd been walking for about 2.5 hours. I know some people will think that sounds impossible, but my brain really does work like that, and on that particular day, it pushed me straight into panic territory. I had no idea where I was, and I had absolutely nothing with me for protection. Once I calmed down enough to think straight, I tried to picture the direction I must have come from, tried to retrace steps I never consciously took. But because I'd been drifting in autopilot, I couldn't piece together a single turn. I thought about approaching the cabin to see if anyone was inside, but around here, people get real protective of their property. There are plenty of stories about folks walking too close to someone's land and getting shot for it. Survival mode kicks in quick out here, and too many people will pull the trigger first and ask questions later. Sad, but true. So, I figured the smartest thing was to keep my distance and only call out for help if I reached the point of absolute desperation. But when I really looked at the cabin again, I noticed someone standing at the window staring directly at me. It looked like a woman, which I tried to take as a good sign, so I inched a little closer. Then a man stepped in behind her holding some kind of knife, and that tiny hope I felt disappeared instantly. By then, I was close enough to see their expressions, their faces, their whole unsettling presence. I could tell instantly that the man wasn't holding that knife in any harmless way. I stopped dead in my tracks, raised my hands, and made a gesture to show I wasn't a threat and that I was leaving. But even while backing away, their faces burned into my mind. They looked awful, dirty, wild-eyed, like people who'd spent way too long cut off from everyone else and had let themselves go in ways that went far beyond hygiene. I walked in what I hoped was the right direction, using the slope of the ground and the angle of the light through the trees to guide me. And for a while, I convinced myself I was making progress. But almost 2 hours later, I still wasn't anywhere familiar. The panic came back full force. I had maybe 2 hours before dark, and the idea of being stuck in some unknown part of the forest after sunset scared the hell out of me. Even in the part of the woods I knew well, I never stayed past dark. Out here in winter, the temperature drops fast, and while I had warm clothes on, they weren't going to keep me alive if I had to stop moving. I stopped walking to reassess the shadows and see if I'd gotten them wrong. I've lived in the woods long enough to know a few things, but I've never been great with orientation. Still, I convinced myself that if I just paused and recalculated, I might find the right direction. That's when I heard a branch snap somewhere behind me. I looked over and saw them, the man and the woman from the cabin, both of them staring at me with the most horrifying expressions I've ever seen. And this time, they each had a knife, both way bigger than the one the man held before. I knew instantly that I wasn't just being watched anymore. I was being hunted on their land. I bolted, yelling that I was armed even though I wasn't. At that point, I had nothing to lose, but it didn't scare them. If anything, it pushed them into some kind of frenzy. They took off after me, and every now and then they let out these guttural, almost animalistic screams, some awful cry that seemed to pump them up even more. I've never heard anything like it. Honestly, I think I'd rather heard a bear roar. Having two human beings completely unhinged sprinting after me like that is a level of terror I still can't properly describe. It shuts something down inside you. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. Then, like some kind of miracle, I suddenly came across a creek and I recognized it instantly. If I crossed it, I wouldn't end up at my house, but I would reach a neighboring village where I could get help. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into the water, even though the current was strong and the cold was the kind that bites straight through your bones. In a couple more weeks, that creek would have been ice. The only reason I didn't freeze up right then was pure adrenaline. When I dragged myself up onto the opposite bank, I glanced back and saw the two of them pacing along the edge, going back and forth like they were trying to work out a way across. The man moved like he was possessed, twitchy and unpredictable, while the woman stood completely still, staring at me with this expression that was more deranged than anything I've ever seen in another human being. I didn't stop moving. They could have found a way over, and the cold was already sinking into my bones. I needed to reach the village fast. Luckily, I knew someone there, and when he saw the state I was in, he didn't hesitate for a second before offering me shelter. I swear that shower felt like the best moment of my entire life. He drove me home the next day. What started as a careless, impulsive walk ended up being the biggest wake-up call I've ever had. I'll never let myself end up in a situation like that again. The woods will always be unpredictable, but we're capable of making the unpredictable at least a little more manageable if we actually prepare ourselves and take precautions. Before I even get into what happened on that trip, I should probably say that nothing about it felt dangerous when we first planned it. My wife and I have always been the kind of couple that prefers quiet places and long stretches of trail instead of beaches or cities, and the Southern Appalachians had been on our list for a long time. We weren't looking for trouble or trying to prove anything. We just wanted a few days out in the woods away from everything. But sometimes the things that start out the most harmless end up turning into the memories you replay in your head far longer than you'd like. And that trip, well, it became one of those memories. We had been planning that hiking trip for weeks, the kind of slow, steady backpacking route through the southern stretch of the mountains that forces you to unplug from everything and pay attention to the world around you. She's the type of person who thrives on that kind of awareness. She likes control, not in an obsessive way, but in a calm, capable, methodical way that honestly makes both of us safer. She notices people quickly, reads their body language, catches details most folks never even register. It just feels like she sees the world a little clearer than the rest of us. When we set off, the first day went smooth, long miles, clean but cold weather, that quiet rhythm you fall into where the only sounds are your boots, your breath, and the wind moving through branches. She checked the map regularly, kept track of mileage, water levels, and even the pace at which the temperature dropped. I handled the heavier gear and let her set the tone. It's a dynamic that works for us, especially out there where there's no margin for sloppiness. The second day, right around late morning, we crossed paths with another couple on the trail. They came up behind us after a long upward stretch, both friendly enough, both smiling the kind of smile hikers give each other just for sharing the same stretch of wilderness. We stopped for a second, swapped the usual small talk about mileage and weather, and then the woman asked if we happened to have a blister pad or a bandage. She said her new shoes were rubbing her heel raw. My wife always over-prepares, so of course we had some. We handed it over, told them to take care, and continued on our way. We'd barely been walking 30 seconds when my wife said in this low, steady voice that meant she was dead serious, that the whole thing had been an act. She said the woman's story didn't match the way she stood, that her shoes weren't laced like someone breaking them in, that her body language was completely wrong for someone in pain. She said the guy barely looked at her heel when his partner mentioned it, like he didn't care at all about the injury, real or fake. She was convinced they were just trying to start a conversation with her specifically and not for any friendly reason. Anyone else might have brushed her off, told her she was reading too much into it, but I've learned the hard way not to underestimate her instincts. She has this sixth sense that borders on uncanny, and every time I've ignored it, I've regretted it. So I told her we'd take every precaution that night, no matter how unnecessary it might seem. We had a method we'd used before, set up one tent in a visible, obvious clearing, the decoy, and hide our real tent deep enough in the trees that you'd only find it if you were actively searching. It's a pain to do, especially after hours of hiking, but it saved us from uncomfortable situations before. So that night we put the fake tent right where any passerby would expect campers to be. Then we carried our real gear deeper into the brush, far from the trail, tucked behind a tangle of rhododendrons and fallen limbs. You never spot it unless you knew precisely where to look. We fell asleep faster than expected, exhausted from the miles. But sometime, deep into the night, both of us shot awake at the exact same moment. It wasn't even a loud sound, just something off, the faintest shift in the air, the kind of noise that doesn't make sense unless someone is moving in a place they shouldn't be. My wife grabbed my arm and we both listened. Then we heard it again, soft footsteps, careful footsteps. We slipped out of the tent as silently as we could and hid in the dark behind a thick outcropping of brush, watching through a gap in the branches. Within seconds, we saw them, the same couple from earlier standing right over our decoy tent. They weren't calling out to see if anyone was inside. They weren't checking the campsite out of curiosity. They were unzipping the door, going through it like they were expecting to find us asleep and defenseless. My heart dropped into my stomach. Whatever reason they'd approached us earlier had nothing to do with a blister. They were looking for us specifically. When they didn't find anyone in the decoy tent, they backed out, looked around, and started scanning the tree line with this slow, deliberate movement that made my skin crawl. They weren't lost. They weren't confused. They were hunting. And when they started walking straight toward the hidden area where our real tent was, I felt something shift inside me. Not panic exactly, but a sudden, cold, heavy anger. They found the second tent. The man crouched in front of it while the woman lingered a step behind him, both tense, both ready for something. That's when something in me snapped. I stood up from behind the brush, stepped into the open, and aimed my firearm directly at them, my voice low and shaking with fury as I demanded to know what they wanted. I must have looked half feral in the darkness. The reaction was immediate. They panicked. They didn't explain, didn't argue, didn't try to talk their way out of anything. They just bolted into the woods like animals caught under a spotlight. It was bizarre. Honestly, if they were rifling through our tent, they clearly expected to find us. But the second I confronted them, they acted like they'd been hit with pure terror. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't expecting a fair fight. They wanted us vulnerable. They wanted us asleep. We stayed up the rest of the night, taking turns watching the perimeter, every little noise sending a jolt straight down my spine. I know it might not sound like the most dramatic story compared to the way some people talk about the woods, but believe me, knowing two strangers were out there in the dead of night searching for us, moving quietly, intentionally with who knows what kind of plan, that's a level of fear you don't forget. It's strange and unsettling in a way that sticks to your ribs. And it's an experience I hope I never have to live through again. What I'm about to describe happened 7 winters ago, and even now, whenever the cold settles over the Blue Ridge Mountains and the days start shortening too fast, that memory comes back with a clarity I don't welcome. I've lived in these mountains most of my life. Out here, distance is measured less in miles and more in time, terrain, and weather. My nearest neighbors are an older couple who live deep in the forest, far enough away that most people wouldn't even realize there's a house back there. We're all pretty isolated, and because of that, we look out for one another. Whenever something breaks or supplies run low or bad weather is coming, we check in. It's just how things work out here. At afternoon, I headed out to warn them about a storm that was rolling in faster than expected. In the summer, the walk takes about 30 minutes on a narrow trail that winds through the trees. In winter, with snow, ice, and frozen ground, it takes closer to 40, sometimes more. By the time I started out, the light was already fading. I wasn't afraid of the dark. Night has always been part of life here. But the storm worried me. The wind was picking up and the air had that sharp electric feel that tells you things are about to turn bad. I should have left the house much earlier, but I got distracted with things I needed to take care of and ended up heading out later than I should have. Still, I didn't want to cancel. At their age, those kinds of check-ins really matter. The forest was quiet in that heavy anticipatory way it gets before snowfall. My boots crunched steadily along the trail and my breath fogged in front of me. About halfway there, I became aware of something behind me, not a sound exactly, more the sense of presence like the woods had shifted. I stopped for a second listening. Nothing obvious, no footsteps, no snapping branches. Still, the feeling didn't go away. Out here, no one wanders the trails without a reason, especially that deep into the woods. I started to notice faint sounds off in the distance, branches shifting, snow compressing under weight, but the wind had picked up enough to blur everything together. Gusts tore through the trees, carrying noise in strange ways, making it hard to tell what was real and what was just the storm settling in. I kept moving, telling myself it was probably nothing, just the forest reacting to the weather. Still, I found myself glancing to the right more than once. That's when I saw him. He stood off the trail, partially hidden between the trees, far enough away that at first I questioned whether he was really there. He was dressed entirely in black, his clothes blending unnaturally well with the shadows. In one hand, he held something long and rigid, like a metal bar or a length of iron hanging loosely at his side. The moment our eyes met, he stopped moving. For a split second, neither of us did anything. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and broke into a run straight toward me. I was horrified, but I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran as fast as I could. My only thought was the cabin ahead, the neighbor's house somewhere deeper in the trees. I forced myself to aim in what I hoped was the right direction, though panic was already tearing holes in my sense of distance and direction. Snow kicked up under my boots as I pushed harder, the wind cutting into my face, my breath coming fast and uneven. Behind me, I heard him gaining ground. He was fast, unnaturally fast, his footsteps heavy and relentless, slicing through the wind. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately regretted it. He was closer than he should have been, his movements sharp and purposeful, the dark shape of that object flashing in his hand as he ran. The trail stopped making sense. Trees blurred together. The slope of the ground shifted, and I couldn't tell if I was still heading straight or drifting off course. Fear drowned out everything else. All I knew was that I couldn't stop. If I stumbled, if I slowed down even slightly, I was certain he'd be on me. The forest that had always felt familiar turned foreign and hostile, the wind howling through the branches as night dropped fast around us. Snow whipped sideways, burning my eyes, and my lungs felt like they were on fire. My legs screamed with every step, but the sound of him behind me never faded. He was still coming. Then through the trees I saw it, the faint outline of the neighbor's house. A single light glowed in the distance, barely visible through the snow. Relief surged so hard it almost dropped me to my knees. I screamed their names over and over, my voice tearing out of me raw and desperate. For a moment I was terrified they wouldn't hear me. The wind was fierce and they're older, their hearing not what it used to be. But then I saw movement at the window. The woman appeared, her face registering confusion and then immediate alarm as she saw me running full speed toward the house. The door opened and I stumbled inside just as it slammed shut behind me. The lock clicked into place a split second before something crashed into the door from the outside. The impact shook the entire frame. We stood there frozen as another violent blow hit the wood, followed by another. Whoever it was threw themselves against the door with a fury that felt almost inhuman. I shouted for them to secure everything, to lock the windows, barricade anything that could be forced open. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely help. The pounding continued for several minutes, relentless and enraged, before it suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. We waited, listening, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. But no further attempts came. The storm intensified, wind howling around the house, snow piling up against the walls. They used their satellite phone to call for help. Getting to us was impossible. Not in that weather and not in that terrain, but the police stayed on the line as long as they could. Calm and attentive, giving instructions, walking us through what to do if the person tried to get in again. Luckily, nothing else happened that night. And by morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was buried in white, eerily peaceful. The police managed to reach the house later that day and check the area, though there was little to find beyond disturbed snow and tracks that disappeared into the forest. The neighbors came back with me to my place, and they stayed there for the rest of the winter. I didn't even hesitate to offer. They're not just neighbors to me, they're family in every way that matters. The thought of something happening to them still makes my chest tighten. That was 7 winters ago. Nothing like it has happened since. But it was enough to change how I move through these mountains, enough to make sure I'm never caught out near dusk again, and never ever in the forest once darkness is fully settled in. Everything. I just don't remember every detail with perfect clarity, and all I can do is pass on what I know for certain. I was 22 years old at the time, and this happened in December of 2001, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. A close friend of mine and I had this tradition of camping every Christmas season. Nothing fancy or extreme, just a few days off the grid before heading back to our families. It was something we'd been doing since high school. And back then, we still thought we were a lot tougher and more capable than we actually were. The spot we chose that year was familiar. A place we camped near before, far enough from any main road that you couldn't hear traffic, but close enough that we felt comfortable being there in winter. The first part of the trip was uneventful, cold but manageable, the kind of quiet that feels heavier in December, where the forest seems stripped down to its essentials. We set up camp before dark, started a small fire, ate, and settled in early because the temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared. At some point during the night, I woke up with that instinctive feeling that something wasn't right. Not a noise exactly, more like a shift in the air. The same way you can feel when someone is standing too close to you without seeing them. I remember lying there staring into the darkness of the tent, listening hard. Every sound blended together, branches creaking, snow brushing against fabric, the fire popping as it died down. I remember thinking that if the fire was still faintly burning, then it couldn't have been very late, probably somewhere around midnight at most. Then I heard something that didn't fit. A heavier sound, slow and deliberate, coming from deeper in the trees. I couldn't tell how far away it was, only that it wasn't an animal moving randomly. Whatever it was, it stopped when the wind died down, and started again when the gusts picked back up, like it understood exactly when it could move without being noticed. That sense of intention was the first thing that truly scared me, the deliberate way a predator moves when it knows exactly what it's doing. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to look outside, unzipping the tent just enough to peer out. What I saw still doesn't fully make sense to me. At the edge of the firelight, barely visible between the trees, there was a shape standing upright and completely still. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it looked wrong in a way I still struggle to explain. Not wrong in a supernatural sense, but wrong in a human sense, like someone trying very hard not to be seen and failing without realizing it. I remember noticing the way it was positioned, slightly hunched, as if it had been watching us for a while. There was no sound or movement coming from it at all, no noticeable breathing, no shifting of weight, nothing, just a presence that felt intentional and patient. The fear hit me all at once, sharp and overwhelming, the kind that makes your thoughts scatter and your body feel heavy and weak at the same time. The feeling of being watched in the middle of the night is absolutely terrifying, and that kind of fear has a way of distorting your senses. I hadn't even realized that Mike was awake too, staring at the exact same thing I was. I think I only snapped out of it when I felt his hand clamp tightly around my arm. I don't remember how long we stayed frozen like that, both of us awake now, barely moving, afraid that any sound would draw attention. At some point, the shape moved with a speed that didn't match its size, disappearing so quickly it made me doubt what I'd seen. That was worse than if it had stayed. The idea that it could move like that silently was enough to convince me we weren't safe. We sat through the rest of the night huddled together, the fire barely alive, only feeding it every now and then to keep from being left in complete darkness, listening to the wind and flinching at every sound. The woods never fully settled again, and neither did we. When morning finally came, everything looked normal. No footprints we could clearly identify. No broken branches close enough to prove anything. We packed up as fast as we could and left without talking much. Both of us clearly shaken but unable to put into words what we were afraid of. In the days that followed, the fear lingered in a strange way, like something unresolved. We talked several times about what we had seen, and we both shared the same strange impression that it looked almost like a person, but far too large, hunched over and generally misshapen. If it had really been a person of that size, it should have left clear marks in the snow, and it hadn't snowed overnight enough to cover any footprints. But at the same time, it didn't make sense that we somehow shared a collective hallucination, both seeing the exact same thing in the same way. We never went back, not to that spot, not for winter camping at all. Whatever was out there that night, whether it was just a person or something worse, it was enough to break a tradition we thought nothing could touch.